Good afternoon, everyone. Before I begin, I have to say, it's hard to follow that. I just want to take a moment to join everyone in thanking Beth and Harlan for organizing such an amazing conference and to all the other people who have made this day possible. I also want to take a moment to thank all of the speakers who are here today because for me, being a part of this list of people is just such an amazing thing that I can't even begin to express how indebted my thinking is to every single one of the people who are speaking here today, and also not just my thinking, but like the way that I be and operate in the world. I like that the work of so many of these series have been, including Texas Foster, has been so transformative for me. But it really is an honor to be able to be here and to share my work in this context. So I'm also going to talk about welfare and welfare reform, and hopefully I'm not going to repeat too much of the history that's already been given. Before I turn to this history, I do want to say a little bit about some of the questions or the ideas that sort of animate my engagement with this history. So when I think about my work, I think one of the questions that I'm really interested in understanding is really this question of why do sort of a general hegemonic we buy into policies that are generally bad for most of us? And I think the question of why do we think we need ways to work, right, is an example of that kind of question. And why is it that, in some sense, right, having some kind of social security net benefits everyone, right, produces increased economic security for everyone, and at the same time, we live in a country in which there is so much tremendous resistance to that idea. So part of what kind of informs my historical exploration is a desire to understand that. So in August of 1996, the Personal Responsibility and Work Opportunity Reconciliation Act, colloquially referred to as welfare reform, was signed into law. The law represented the most dramatic transformation in the U.S. welfare state since the New Deal, ending federal entitlement to aid to families with dependent children, or AFDC, and replacing it with a state block grants program called Temporary Assistance to Needy Families, or TANF. Under TANF, right, assistance was time-limited, contingent on work, and subject to a range of stricter eligibility requirements. At the signing of the law, Lily Hardin, an African-American single mother of four and former welfare recipient from North Little Rock, Arkansas, introduced President Clinton. Clinton, in turn, began his speech by describing his first encounter with Hardin. Clinton said, "I said, Lily, what's the best thing about being off welfare?" And she looked me straight in the eye and said, "When my boy goes to school and they say, 'What does your mama do for a living?' he can give an answer." I've never forgotten that, Mrs. Clinton. And when I saw the success that she's had in the past 10 years, I can tell you, you've had a bigger impact on me than I've had on you. And I thank you for the power of your example for your families and for all of America. Kind of feels like you need to take a shower after you read that. The positioning of Hardin's transformation, described as from dependence to dignity, from welfare to work, at the inception of this restructuring is notable. Hardin's success was attributed to participation in one of the experimental welfare support programs that federal policy was modeled after. It was clearly made to represent, right, mythical welfare queen reform. A powerful figure within the public imagination, the welfare queen functioned as a racialized and gendered embodiment of the excesses associated with public assistance. Excesses of consumption, sexuality, reproduction, and dependency. These excesses are positioned as needing to be curbed with state austerity under the law. An invention of the Reagan era, the construction of the welfare queen responded to the victories of the welfare rights activists described by many people here today, increasing access to welfare programs for women of color by rewriting this shift, to greater access as a shift from deserving to undeserving others. With this shift, welfare itself and the supposed culture of poverty that it fostered became understood as a sign of what was wrong with the big government, and welfare became positioned then as the problem to be solved. However, and I think this is important, right? When we think about welfare policy, this time period, it's not really the question of economic inequality that is at the forefront. It's actually how do we fix the welfare system, right? Welfare itself is a problem, and the construction of welfare as a problem, right, displaces the consideration of economic inequality. However, while Hardin supposedly embodied the potential successes of the law in addressing this problem, the model she was held up as providing for similarly situated women also reveals important tensions within the law itself. The welfare law framed its mission as protecting and preserving the heteronormative family in order to protect and preserve the nation. It opened with the proclamation that marriage is the foundation of a successful society. Its preamble is littered with references to the horrors of teenage pregnancy and female-headed households, and its passage was linked to a promise that restructuring the welfare system would restore the nation to its original family values. This framing resonates with the history of maternalist federal and local policies that organize welfare provision through the family wage and use programs like ABC to link public assistance for women specifically to their work as mothers, citizens. However, this framing was also in many ways a poor fit for describing the changes the law actually institutionalized. Certainly, marriage promotion programs and penalties for teenage mothers were part of the law, and the law reinforced marriage as an institution simply in ways that it punished single mothers. However, the strong emphasis on moving welfare recipients from welfare to work also diverges significantly from earlier social welfare policy that sought to protect women from the degradation of wage labor so that they could devote their time to raising future citizens. Rather, the power of Hardin's example seems to be in the reframing of good mothering for working class women as not in the work of raising children, but rather in modeling of labor discipline and economic self-sufficiency for future generations. In a society that frequently fetishizes the need to protect and nurture an abstract figure of the child, and despite the law's own obsessive rhetorical concern for the plight of children not in two-parent heteronormative households, it is notable that the implicit message of the policies enacted by the law is that impoverished children do not need care as much as they need role models. Not only is the actual labor of mothering unrecognized, the work of mothering is rewritten as participation in a low-wage labor market, highlighting the futures the law imagines for these children and their mothers. George W. Bush underscored this point when he declared the 2002 reauthorization of the law that a work requirement is a punishment. A work requirement is part of liberation in our society. Despite the rhetoric around marriage and families and saturated debate about the welfare policies enacted in 1996 did not primarily seek to produce heteropatriarchal families as much as they sought to curb government assistance by pushing recipients into low, and in the case of workfare, no-wage work. In this sense, the vision put forward of good motherhood in the law differed significantly from the welfare programs that emerged from maternal activism in the progressive era. However, the spectacle of putting women to work outside the home is also not new in the history of the U.S. welfare state. While Hardin's example is quite different from the vision of social welfare provision that sought to assimilate Americanized working class women to domestic norms, it resonates strongly, almost uncannily, with the federal government's efforts to put free women to work in the aftermath of the Civil War. One of the first federal welfare programs, the Freedmen's Bureau, was charged with managing the transition from slavery to freedom during the Reconstruction era. Much like AFDC, it was plagued by deep anxieties about promoting dependency, giving aid to undeserving populations, cultivating ideals of domesticity within the Black family, and expanding the reach of the federal government, which hindered its efforts at land redistribution and ultimately led to its demise. The Bureau's relief efforts instead focused on short-term emergency assistance and on promoting security for the newly emancipated through the institutions of work and marriage. Bureau officials understood marriage essential to the process of turning formerly enslaved peoples into citizens, and actively promoting domesticity amongst free women was key to the Bureau's civilizing mission. However, despite the emphasis on domesticity, Bureau officials simultaneously pushed free women to enter into coercive labor contracts, often requiring them to return to the same kind of agricultural and domestic labor that they had performed while enslaved. The parallels between the practices of the Freedmen's Bureau and the policies instituted at the end of the 20th century are striking. In these two very different historical moments, both employed marriage and forced labor to privatize responsibility for economic inequalities and to justify austerity for particularly racial populations. In doing so, they constructed gendered forms of citizenship for Black women in terms of contradictory obligations that were in practice impossible to fulfill. Although the Freedmen's Bureau is unusually located in feminist histories of the welfare state, the historical resonances between these two moments are important, I think, because they demand a theory of state power that can account for the state's multiple converging and also sometimes conflicting interests in intersecting structures of domination. While many scholars have rigorously documented the welfare state's role in ensuring capitalism's future, maintaining racial hierarchy, or enforcing heteronormative gender roles, the dominant tendency has been to theorize these aspects of state power independently, despite the fact that the state works from all of these ends simultaneously. What does a theory of state power that centers this simultaneity look like? And specifically grounded in historical moments, how are the capitalist state, the racial state, and the heteropatriarchal state mutually constitutive? At the same time, how does the state navigate the sometimes distinct interests of these structures of domination and retain an appearance of coherence? What instabilities does attention to these processes reveal, and how might we think about these instabilities as possible levers for social change? As a way of engaging these questions, and drawing out parallels to the more recent restructuring of the welfare state, I would like to turn specifically to the anxieties and forms of regulation provoked by racialized figures of female vagrancy during the Reconstruction era. As Nayan Shaw has demonstrated, proper intimacy in the private sphere was seen as essential to the proper functioning of public life. As transient subjects, male vagrants' lack of attachment to home and family was a threat to the cultivation of liberal political subjects, stability, and a disciplined workforce that settled domesticity secure. Without heteronormative domesticity as an anchor, the male vagrant operated with no compulsion to fulfill the kinds of obligations the support of dependents required, particularly the obligation to work, and instead tended towards dependency and femininity and stuff, right? So in other words, the problem with the male vagrant was in some sense that he refused to be a man, and he refused that sort of process of becoming masculine. In the Reconstruction context, the fear that emancipation would lead to an epidemic of Black vagrancy was a powerful and tangible force in shaping the practices of the Freedmen's Bureau. And the idea that public assistance would contribute to this epidemic emerged as one of the strongest arguments to undermine the Bureau's work. And so here we might see, right, this principle, right, of a minimum welfare standard. So depictions of vagrancy during this period bore striking resemblance to the welfare queen. And I actually have a wonderful image that illustrates it, but it's like so racist that I don't actually want to show it. But I'm going to describe it a little bit, or describe a little bit of what these images look like. So images of vagrancy tend to focus on images of indulgence, right? So the idea of laziness, excessive sexuality, a lack of self-control, like overconsumption of food, right? Improper performances of gender. So, for example, on one image, it's literally this idea that free people would take over everything. And so you have an image of the Capitol building, and in front of it there is this sort of enormous free person, right, lounging, and the figure is supposed to be male, but lounging in this like highly feminized way, and surrounding him, right, are these like white men toiling away in the fields, and white women and children looking on in horror, and all of this language, right, about how, you know, hard-working taxpayers are going to have to support free people in their laziness, right, which sounds very familiar, right, if we think back to anti-welfare systems. And this, right, you know, just to underscore, right, like this is like months after the end of slavery, right, that these sort of inversions of like who is actually doing the work are so distinct. Okay, so vagrancy was generally thought of as either a natural proclivity of free people that had to be curtailed, or a lingering cultural effect of the degradation that conditions of slavery have produced, particularly the denial of access to the heteronormative family and its civilizing functions. In either sense, Black vagrancy was cast as a failure to become fully modern and free gendered subjects. State officials, the define freedom narrowly as entering into long-term labor contracts with white employers, adopting heteropatriarchal gender roles and kinship structures as defined in the institution of marriage, and taking individual responsibility for the economic inequalities that centuries of slavery have engendered. They enforce this definition by labeling other practices of freedom, for example, exercising the newfound right to mobility, the refusal of wage work, and sexuality expressed outside of the confines of the family, as both crimes of vagrancy and also signs that black people were not truly prepared to be free. The policing of vagrancy was a way of producing and policing gendered subjects as well. The male vagrant poses threat precisely because his existence was antithetical to the stability, discipline, settlement, and attachment to a domestic sphere that characterized the masculine liberal subject. However, free women were subject to the same vagrancy laws that free men were, even though gender constructions of citizenship precluded women from being free liberal subjects in the same ways as men. While for men to be vagrant meant failing to take up the responsibilities of independent citizenship and instead remaining in a feminized state of dependency, proper citizenship for women was in fact defined by dependency, and so the meanings associated with female vagrancy were more complex and contradictory. Two figures dominated public discourse about black female vagrancy during this time. The first and most prominent of these figures was the prostitute, right? And this figure drew upon and recirculated ideas about black female sexuality that had been central to the productive economy of slavery. Informed by a dichotomous construction of good and bad women, racialized beliefs about free women's character were often more significant than any actual behavior in determining whether she should be charged with vagrancy. As Hannah Rosa notes, given racial constructions of black women's heterosexuality, virtually all free women who occupied public space could be vulnerable to charges against vagrancy because of what their bodies signified, right, to the white public. In contrast to the male vagrant who embodied improper dependency, in the case of prostitution, it was women's potential economic and sexual independence from the domestic sphere that was threatening. The second, and perhaps more contradictory figure of black female vagrancy that emerged in public discourse was that of the housewife. While the Bureau vehemently promoted marriage and sought to organize people into privatized heteropatriarchal families that were defined by a gendered division of labor, freed women who chose to withdraw their labor from the public sphere and redirect it toward their own families were often accused of female loaferism or, quote, playing the lady. As one official noted, most of the freed women who have husbands are not at work, while they are as nearly idle as it is possible for them to be, pretending to spin, knit, or something that really amounts to nothing. Similarly, another observed of free women who took on the role of housewives, are they not some sort of vagrants as they are living without employment? The figure of the vagrant housewife illustrates three important points, I think. First, while anxieties about prostitution criminalized presence in public space, the construction of the vagrant housewife targeted free women in the private sphere, despite the fact that vagrancy is generally regarded as a public crime. Although the Bureau actively promoted marriage in other contexts as a means of cultivating responsible citizens and privatizing economic responsibility onto legally defined households, the domestic sphere remained a site of state surveillance. In other words, while the private sphere can function as the basis for obligations, do not carry with it rights to privacy or protections from wage labor for free women. Rather than protect free women from work in the fields, the domestic sphere actually required that labor. One Texas Bureau officer observed, the women are generally opposed to working in the field, being supported by the freed men, have had considerable trouble to point out the error of this course, have in every instance in making speeches to free people explain the necessity of assisting in the support of their families, to be economical and labor diligently. Freed women's responsibilities to their families was first and foremost to labor diligently outside the home, right, in order to ensure their material support. The erasure of housework in this context also functioned to undermine potential claims for a family wage, suggesting that freed women's labor should make up the difference between what male-headed households earned and what it cost to reproduce the household. Second, the idea that freed women simply played the lady when they engaged in feminized activities illustrates the way that gender operates as a racial structure. Behaviors that would have been considered normative for white women became evidence of deviance in freed women, while for white women, doing femininity was central to the production of a gendered identity that appeared both real and natural. Freed women who did the same were seen as simply engaged in play, imitating white norms that remained unnatural to them. Despite the fact that in other contexts, Bureau officials compelled freed women to act out white domesticity, these acts failed to have what Judith Butler might call a performative effect. Right? Imitation remained simply imitation and never produced the appearance of a true femininity. Race operated as a persistent barrier to being recognized as truly women, and freed women could only play as ladies. They could never truly achieve that status, despite officials' insistence that conforming to gendered ideals was the basis of citizenship. Third, in the discourse about vagrant housewives, the devaluation of reproductive labor goes beyond it being unwaged and not regarded as work to it actually being regarded as unnecessary and a waste of time when done in the service of Black families and communities. While for freed women, the redirection of their labor toward their own families and communities and away from white employers provided a powerful alternative expression of freedom, Bureau officials could not only not see this as work, but the need for care in Black households entirely remained invisible to them. Right? In this sense, the construct of the vagrant housewife did not just erase housework, right? It erased the very need for care, or even sort of the very idea, right, that Black subjects had needs at all. Okay? And I think that there's a lot of resonance between that and the way that the Harding story is framed as the role of mothering, right, is to model disciplined labor. Both sex workers and housewives engaged in work, but were still seen as vagrant. Right? This lends credence to Linda Kerber's observation that the crime in vagrancy is not so much not working as it is a failure to engage in work that is observable, contractual, and regular. And I would also add, in this context, in service of a white employer. And I think that, thinking about that idea of observable, contractual, regular, and kind of like the managerial logic or the rationalization of the body that is required, so it's not just that you have to work, but that you have to be able to be seen working. In addition, the Bureau went to extensive efforts to prevent vagrancy among women by adopting strategies of both limited public assistance and directed freed women into agricultural and domestic work. These strategies included pushing women into long-term labor contracts, transporting women to regions where there were labor shortages, and developing industrial schools that would specifically train freed women to work as live-in domestic workers and more. And I can say more about the details of some of these programs in the Q&A if people want, but I just want to highlight a few things about the program that I think are particularly relevant for the comparison. So first, throughout these programs, work was consistently framed as a pathway to freedom for freed women, even though it frequently required a return to slavery-like conditions. Particularly in the case of domestic work, the supposedly civilizing effects of working in a white home were often emphasized, and freed women were often forced to endure separation from their own children, right, in order to take these positions. And I think when we think about what would freedom mean, right, in this moment, being able to sort of establish and maintain connections to one's children was a really important part of what freedom meant for Black women. Second, free women who were wives often had their labor contracted out by their husbands, right, given kind of the gender structure of labor. And husbands were often encouraged to discipline their wives if they failed to work in the ways that their labor contracts prescribed. So we might think about also the idea of the vagrant housewife, that sort of the target of the Bureau is her husband, right? And the husband needs to make the wife work harder, right? So we can think of this as an example of how labor discipline also becomes a tool of creating and enforcing gender hierarchies, right, within the families. And then third, these work programs were essential to securing the legitimacy of the Bureau itself, right? In the face of public hostility, demonstrating that free people were indeed deserving of citizenship was important to Bureau officials. And that importance, is partly, I think, it was important to Bureau officials. It was also in order to have a job as in the Freedmen's Bureau, we had to demonstrate that these people were worthy of assistance, right? So it's also important in an institutional way. So work programs offered a way for the Bureau to do this and to in turn demonstrate its own legitimacy. This proved unsuccessful, however, right, and the Bureau itself was very short-lived. So given this history, what is to be learned from situating the Freedmen's Bureau's efforts to combat vagrancy within the historical trajectory of the welfare state? In conclusion, I want to highlight a few important patterns that I see emerging. First, placing the Freedmen's Bureau more centrally in a feminist analysis of the U.S. welfare state potentially complicates our understanding of the relationship between the welfare state, the heteropatriarchal family, and the production of racial stratification. Looking at the progressive era of the New Deal, we see the way that the heteropatriarchal family became a vehicle for making claims on the state and the consequent material support the state provided working-class white families as a way of quelling working-class revolt. And I think other people have alluded to this history and talked about it in more depth, but I think we can think about mothers' pensions programs. You can also think about the institutionalization of the family wage for some workers. Also things like supports of home ownership as well for white working-class families. So a lot of times, the families that get held up, like in our nostalgia for family values, right, as kind of the sort of natural family or the way that families are supposed to be, are actually families that the state has invested a lot in creating. And I think it's really important that we think about welfare not just in terms of assistance to people who are impoverished, right, but also that welfare is actually, right, like circulating in lots of, the state is supporting lots of different kinds of people in lots of different kinds of ways. And a lot of times, right, those things are invisible to us. So when we think about that family that is held up, this like kind of family, right, that embodies family values, that's actually a family that is very much a state construction, right, or is a product of state investment. If we compare that to the way that ideas of family were deployed during Reconstruction, we see that in relation to Black families, the family was used as a vehicle for the privatization of inequality and as a basis for constructing an obligation to be self-sufficient with little or no public support. Given the extent to which the pathologization of the Black family has been central to 20th and 21st century discourse about racial and economic inequality, I think this is an important point. Right? The heteronormative family itself only appears natural because of the way state policies invest in it and shore it up. The state, however, does not invest in Black families in these same ways, and one consequence of this is then that those families can be labeled as deviant and unnatural, which becomes fuel for continued disinvestment. Second, the clear parallels between the Reconstruction era discourse on vagrancy and the late 20th century anti-welfare discourse highlights both the specificity and expansiveness of anti-Black racism in the structuring of the welfare states, and the way that anti-Black racism is itself expressed through constructions of gender equity. Representations like the welfare queen can be read as reinventions of representations of vagrancy that express white anxieties about emancipation. And while the language around race in the post-civil rights era may have shifted, right, the structure of the ways that gender deviance in particular is employed to connote racial differences not. Situating the Freedmen's Bureau in the history of anti-welfare discourse certainly lends credence to Dorothy Roberts' observation that white Americans have been unwilling to create social programs that will facilitate Blacks' full citizenship and economic well-being, even when those programs would benefit whites. In addition, I would add that when we think about, right, the neoliberal, right, restructuring, or sort of the neoliberal moment that we're in, and the negative impact that this process has on a broad range of groups, it is important to recognize that this process has its antecedents in the modalities of regulation that developed to restrict Blacks in many ways. And so I think that we can think about, instead of maybe thinking about this as a new moment, we might also think about this as a moment in which the technologies of regulation that were employed against formerly enslaved people are being expanded and employed against larger and larger groups of people. Finally, I think there is an important point to be made in these examples about how the state reproduces itself and the role that populations whose reproduction is rendered unimportant play in that reproduction. I began with a story told about the Lord Hardin at the signing of the welfare law in 1996. Almost 20 years later, I look again at Hardin's story as a story about the failures of the law. Hardin passed away in 2014 at at the age of 59. And if racism is, as Ruth Wilson Gilmore argues, a state-sanctioned and extra-legal production expectation of a differentiated vulnerability to premature death, then Hardin was certainly a victim. Her transition from welfare to work did not significantly improve her financial situation, as she struggled with illness and high medical bills for most of her life, despite the fact that she was a success and that she remained off welfare. In both these time periods, I think it's easy actually to identify the ways in which policies failed to benefit the populations that were targeted for improvement, right? That these policies were not necessarily really even about improving the material situation of women on welfare or improving the material situation of free women. Rather, I would argue that constructions like the Baker and the welfare team function as ways of displacing the contradictions that emerge between heteropatriarchal gender, capitalist labor demands, and racial violence. And that the policies that respond to these constructions reproduce, reiterate, and make coherent state power in the face of these contradictions. What Hardin, that example, perhaps actually teaches us is about the continued power of the spectacle of forced labor and the role this spectacle plays in the reproduction of state legitimacy in moments